What I want to show you now is a couple of tricks to view your particles a little bit better, especially if you're going to be using hypervoxels or any effects with them, and just some different ways that we can show the display within Lightwave and within the OpenGL and without having to render. And I also am going to show you a couple of tricks we can do with lights and using particles. So I'm going to start out just by creating first a particle object, just an HV emitter. Our birth rate of 100 should be fine. I'll set our particle limit to 100. And what I also want to do is set our particle lifetime to 300 frames to match our timeline, which is currently set to 300 frames. Increase our motion for explosion to 3. We're just going to take a look. And we can see just our particles expanding. I'm going to reduce our resistance to 0.5 for those particles. And I also want to go and add a little bit of gravity, so I'm going to do a negative 0.5 on the Y. We can take a look. We can just see a fairly simple little explosion of particles. What I do want to do is reduce this a little bit more. 0.5 might be a little too high, so we'll bring that down to negative 0.02. We'll just see a little bit of motion on that Y axis as it's just kind of coming down. And fairly straightforward. And what I'm going to do is add another emitter into our scene. Let's select particle, HV emitter, and our nozzle is going to be parent emitter. And I can close this out, M on the keyboard, and select emitter 1 for our parent item. And now we can have those particles being created. For our second emitter, Shift O and open up our object properties. And now we're going to make a couple of changes to our particle. We'll change our lifetime to 300. I also want to reduce our resistance, or actually in this case increase our resistance. We'll do a value of 2. And that way our particles will kind of stay behind. We need to go back to our generator tab and increase our particle limit. Go ahead and max that out. Go to motion, add a little bit of vibration. We'll set that to 1 and see how that's going to look. And that looks like it might be a little bit too much for this effect. Bring that down to 0.5. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to actually just bring that down to 0.4, a little bit lower, so they don't spread out quite so much. Under the generator, change our birth rate to 50. And now let's take a look at a couple of different ways we can see this scene before we render it and have a much better idea of what we're looking at, especially if we're going to be using hypervoxels. First, what I want to take a look at is hit D on the keyboard, which is going to bring up our display options. And under the camera view, we can set camera view background. Now I want to change this to the backdrop color, and by default that is black. So now we're going to see a nice black background in contrast to our particles, and that'll help us see these particles a little bit better. But we can go beyond that and create a much better view of what's going on in the scene. So I'm going to hit Control F6, and now we can do this with both a regular particle emitter and an HV emitter. Just to show this effect, it will work with both types of emitters, and whether or not you're going to be using hypervoxels with them really depends on the scene, but we're still going to be using hypervoxels to display these. So we'll add in hypervoxels, we can double click, and now I want to turn on emitter 2, which is going to be all of our secondary particles that are showing up, and I want to turn on show particles. And right now it's all very jumbled, basically just a wireframe, because our object type is set to surface. If I change this to a sprite, what we now see is kind of a smoky effect and a nice little preview of what these particles are going to look like. Well, let's go ahead and change this and make it a little more interesting. I'm going to go to the shading option, and I want to adjust our color. So I'm going to select the T to open up the texture editor for our color, and I want to change this to a gradient. Now we want to control this gradient based on the particle age. So now we have this set to relative particle age, and we can adjust this overall value throughout the timeline of our animation. I'm going to add in just 2 keys, and I'll set our first key to be a bright yellow and very close to white, and we can already see that shading change. The next key I'm going to set is going to be a darker orange, or a little bit of a lighter orange, and then we can go just below that and create something a little bit closer to black, but still within our orange range. And now we can adjust these sliders and see this a little bit better. Kind of pull them in. We can change the end amount if needed to go beyond the value of 1, because that's based to a relative amount of time. And what I'm going to do with this last slider that I just added in, the last key, is change this to almost a black. And now, if we scrub through our animation, we'll be able to see those changes. And we end up with a really cool preview of what this would look like if you were to have sort of a fiery effect. And I'm going to go back to our first key and just brighten that up a little bit closer to white. So we have a very bright beginning, and then that nice change overall to our scene, getting darker and darker. If we go to just our use texture to close that out and take a look at some of our other settings, we can adjust the geometry and the overall size of our particles. So we can make them larger. If we want a very smooth surface and nice little smooth preview, we can also reduce that a little bit more and have a little bit choppier. If we go to our hypertexture, now we can edit the actual sprite, increase our frequencies, maybe our small power. If I increase our texture amplitude, we're really going to see a nice cutaway. I want to increase our scale. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up to 3 on all of our axes. And you can go through and take a look at all of the available options. We have ripples and turbulence, dented, the FBM, but I'm just going to use crumple. Maybe reduce that texture amplitude a little. We could also increase the dissolve if we wanted to dissolve that into our scene. And we could also set up a texture effect. We could do turbulence. And we can just see that overall nice preview of everything going on, and also a little preview of our turbulence effect. I could change that to billowing. But mainly most of those effects we're not going to be able to see. And also keep in mind, these sprites can be rendered. We don't necessarily have to use these just for OpenGL preview. But they are a very helpful part of the program to be able to really let us see kind of what's going on within our scene. And I want to create a little bit of camera motion. I'm going to select our camera just with Shift-C, hit M on the keyboard to bring up its motion options, and I want to target our emitter 1. And now I'm going to scrub to our last frame of 300, select our camera, T on the keyboard for move, and I'm just going to move this around and create a little bit of an animation for the camera. Just kind of zooming in to our explosion we've created. And I might bring that a little bit closer to begin with. And we just see something really interesting and something very nice within the OpenGL preview that we normally wouldn't see if we were just working with the scene in the standard views. And if you are going to be applying hypervoxels to this, you can of course replace this after you've had a good idea of what you want everything to look like. And if we switch to the perspective view, we'll still be able to see this effect. Of course, our background will be the default for our perspective view background. And in this case, without the black background, we can really see a very neat looking object. And we could always adjust the color of that object and the different particles. We could go to our scene editor, take our emitter 2, right mouse click on it, and we could change that to black, or I could change it to orange. Maybe I could use brown. We'll go ahead and set brown and close that out. Switch back to our camera so it's no longer selected. And now those particles kind of fade in and match up a little bit better, at least once we get later into the animation. But it's a really neat preview and a nice volume that we can see. And with that camera motion kind of flying through the hypervoxels and these sprites, we can see all of the different effects kind of blending into each other. And also keep in mind that we still have the first emitter that we could also add sprites to. But what's going to happen when we're working with multiple HV objects is we will get some strange squares that are going to show up and some display errors. And we'll take a look at that. Control F6, open up hypervoxels, and I'm going to turn on emitter 1, change this to sprite, go to geometry, show those particles, just kind of scale those down, and now what we're seeing is that black background and just kind of squares that cover up everything. So there's not a whole lot of good blending between two different objects, but if we're just working with one, then it works out pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and deactivate emitter 1. And let's take a look at something we can do with lights as well, which is a really cool effect. And what I want to do is add in first just a point light. So we'll go to our Lights tab, Add Point Light, and we can keep that named Light, which should be fine. What I am going to do is go up to our surface editor and change that light to the color of black, just by right mouse clicking and setting the color. And this will help it blend in when it's not selected. I'm going to open up our light panel and turn on lens flare, and we can see a lens flare in our scene if you have that option turned on. If you don't, you can hit D on the keyboard, and then under camera view, OpenGL lens flares. So you can go ahead and turn that on, and then you'll be able to see these lens flares show up, which is also very helpful to kind of give an idea of what your scene's going to look like. And even if you're just going to be using maybe volumetric lights, this will still work out really well and give a nice blend. I'm going to go to our lens flare options, turn off our central ring, and now we can adjust our flare intensity. And what I want to do before I use this object any further is just set up an envelope for our flare intensity to give it a little bit of animation. I'm going to select our key, and that way we can add key points, and I'm just going to click in and out, just moving through the 300 frames just to add a bit of flickering and make it more interesting. We can then close that out and close out our panel, and then we'll be able to see that flickering throughout the animation and within the OpenGL preview. And now that we have that light set up, I am going to now link this to our first emitter. Now our first emitter we have set up with a particle limit of 100 particles, so we know we're going to need 100 clones of this light. I'm going to go to our Dynamics tab, select our Effects linker, select for our particle emitter 1, and replace object with light number 2. Set our copy amount to 100, And the rest of our settings we can pretty much leave the same. We don't really need to change the size or have them spin at all, because they are just a light and their rotation really doesn't matter as a point light. Our pre-behavior, we could have to the original. We would see them all in the center. We could have them stay. Basically, once they're created, and they would show up outside of the box. That might not be what we want, so I'm going to set this to size dissolve, which works a little better for objects, but still with the light it should work out pretty well. You can click OK, and it's going to create 100 lights, and we see, since all of our lights are grouped together right now, just a big dot on our scene and right in the middle of our screen. But once we start moving into the animation, then we can see it break up in all of those different lens flares. And of course each of our lights is now connected to the beginning of each of our objects. And within the perspective view we're not going to be able to see those lens flares, but we can tell that we now have a point light connected to the end of this particle effect. So that's a really cool thing we can do to create some interesting scenes, is to just connect these different lights. And I set up that animation behavior with the envelope ahead of time, and that is applied to every single light. Of course they are sort of blinking in unison, which may not be what you want, so we could always adjust the envelope throughout different lights, maybe copy and paste different envelopes on other light settings, or we can move our keyframes around a bit to create a little bit of variation. But we end up with a really nice OpenGL preview of our scene, and something to give us an idea ahead of time without rendering, because it is going to take a little while to render most frames, even though a sprite animation will render out fairly quickly. But it's always nice to be able to see your scene while you're working on it. So right now we can switch to maybe our perspective view, zoom in, and take a look at the relationships and distances between different objects. Scrub through our animation. We could have it just constantly play, and then we could move through the animation and take a look at different areas. So it's a really cool way to preview your scene ahead of time and get a much better idea of what it is that you're working with. And of course the camera view is going to give you the best idea, but this does look pretty good overall. And if we were to render this out with the sprites, it's actually going to look about the same as what we see right now, except the lens flare options might be a little bit brighter in our render than they are showing up currently in the scene. So that's just something cool you can do when you're working on different animations. And then you can always make a preview. You can go to the lower right, make preview, and then that'll render out all of our frames, save it as a compressed animation file, and we can play that back in real time.